Hello, everyone. My name is Timea Crofony, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the next episode of our series, The EAIS Talks on Israel Studies. And I also have the honor of introducing Professor Haggai Ram. Please welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Haggai Ram is a professor of Middle East history at the Department of Middle East Studies in Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. And his main areas of teaching and research are the social and cultural histories of Iran and the Levant, including Palestine, Israel. In addition to numerous articles and book chapters, he is the author of Myth and Mobilization in Revolutionary Iran, Reading Iran in Israel, and Iranophobia, the Logic of an Israeli Obsession. And today, we will talk about his latest book, Intoxicating Zion, A Social History of Hashish in Mandatory Palestine and Israel, which was published by the Stanford University Press in 2020. And even though the book was published 2 years ago, and our interview series are mainly focused on the new papers and books, I found Intoxicating Zion so exceptional that it would be a shame not to include it into our series and thus somehow deprive you, our audience, of Professor Ram's super interesting insights and conclusions. And last but not least, the book won the award for the best book in Israel Studies, sponsored by the Israeli Institute of Israel Studies and by the Concordia University Library in the last year. So now we can probably just dive deep into your book. And first of all, I really want to say that I enjoyed reading it so much. I think that you were able to create a truly fascinating piece of work. And for me personally, I thank you.
You make me blush.
Because, yeah, for me personally, it was kind of detective investigation almost that is written in very approachable and engaging style. I'm sorry. Because you used excerpts from poems, from newspaper articles and other sources as an illustration of the whole social dynamic of hashish in a given era. And for our audience, also, it might be important to say that your book, Intoxicating Zion, examines and follows the social history of hashish basically from the 1920s to the aftermath of 1967 war, from Ottoman Empire through mandatory Palestine and through the establishment of the state in 1948 and following years. And I'm really sorry for my coughing. Maybe another important point to mention is the fact that there is no previous historical work on such a topic, and especially connecting the politics, economics, culture, and society through the perspective of the drugs itself. So please feel free to add anything to the description of the book. And my question is basically, why do you think that the history of drugs in the Levant, and specifically Palestine, Israel, has escaped academic attention for so long from the perspective of history and sociology and anthropology? And although Israel is, for example, now a world leader in medical cannabis research, especially after 1995, when the Knesset allowed the regulated access to medical cannabis. And maybe also, how did you find this kind of gap in the knowledge?
It's an excellent question. First of all, I think the first thing that needs to be said with regard to your question of why there's been such a neglect of interest in drug history in Palestine, Israel. First of all, this is part of a larger trend in the sense that it was not until the late 1990s, early 2000, beginning of the 21st century, that historians have begun to give more interest or to focus more on drug history. Until that time, actually, drugs were, the area of pharmacologists, chemists, biologists, criminologists, but not historians. So since the beginning of the 21st century, more historians have begun to give more and more attention to the topic. And again, in the process, they have come across thousands of untapped sources, archival sources, which they could actually then use and apply their training and methodologies in order to investigate this very fascinating world. B, the reason that the Middle East in general and Palestine, Israel have been in the sidelines of this research is that until very recently, drug history was overshadowed or was dominated by scholars of the Americas, that is Latin America and the United States and Europe. Americas because of the US purported dominant role in the war on drugs. So scholarly research focused on these geographical areas. C, there is another reason. Social history and looking into such topics as drugs. I mean, until 20 years ago, if I were to, even 20 years ago, which is not that long ago, if I were to suggest that I'm going to do drug history, focus on drugs, I would never, people would look at me and the scorn would be endless. Such engagements with such purportedly esoteric topics was not really in the mainstream. But now, because of social history, because of cultural history, we more and more understand the importance of these topics for the understandings of larger processes and trends in modern and pre-modern history. So I think these are, I'm sure that there are more reasons, but I think that taken together, I think these are the reasons why drug history on the Middle East in general and Palestine and Israel in particular have been in the margins and have not flourished, as it were. You mentioned something about the fact that Israel is a world leader in medical cannabis research after 1995. First of all, I do not agree with you. I think that this is more of a myth than a reality. And it is a myth because Israel, I think, is not the leader that it has made to be seen. I think that there are other countries such as Canada who have much more prominent role. And beside the point, I think that the research in medical cannabis is a worldwide phenomenon. Israel here is not an exceptional player, an exceptional agent. And it is a worldwide trend that is aimed at stripping cannabis of its connotations with drugs and turning it into a medicine that is innocent, that does not have the baggage of a drug, right, that it had previously. So this is not an Israeli invention. This is not Israel is not an exceptional force. It is made to be seen as an exceptional force precisely because the big companies and finance have an interest in demonstrating the benign role of cannabis as a medicine and not as a drug.
Even though it's the same substance.
It's the same substance that has been used and traded since antiquity.
So basically, it's just a change of discourse, right?
Absolutely.
Uh,
Which is more attuned to to the neoliberal economic system and to consumerism and so on and so forth.
Thank you for clarification. And also, as you mentioned, that like 20 or 30 years ago, the research, not that it would not be possible, like I mean the academical one, but people would presume that you are kind of lunatic looking at drugs like this.
Right.
So you also see somehow that academia or scholarship about drugs or academic approaches were kind of biased also towards certain substances as well.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Because again, I think this is a trend that began with with a cultural turn, as it were, with history paying more attention to culture, right? To society, to the ordinary people. How do they engage with their everyday existence? And there's also consumption studies, which are not that old either. So all of these have turned our attention to those so-called fringe issues and subjects, and turned our attention to the importance, to their significance, political, economic, and social, and so on. Absolutely.
I think that we will get to the point in our discussion about what happened basically that this change occurred, but maybe we can start more chronologically, and I would like to ask you to give us some overview, if it's possible, of the most important historical events and under which circumstances was Palestine-Israel region made main route for the smuggling hashish from Lebanon and Syria to Egypt during the period you cover in the book?
Sure. Well, the first findings that actually struck me were that, at least, to the best of my knowledge and my research into the topic, is that Palestine, until the late Ottoman period, and I would even dare say the beginning of the Mandatory period, was not such, or cannabis was not such a powerful or attractive intoxicant in the everyday lives of Palestinians. As opposed to India, which is a cannabis-oriented culture, right? Even as opposed to Egypt, which has the longest history with cannabis in the Arab Middle East, goes back at least to the Middle Ages, medieval period. But that changed, and that changed in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, and I was intrigued. Why? I mean, why has that transformation taken place so late? And my research has shown that until the late, again, you have Egypt, which is the main, as I mentioned, the main consuming country in the Middle East, in the region, in the Levant, as it were. And until the late Ottoman period, Greece was the main country that produced and exported cannabis or hashish to Egypt to fulfill the demand, the Egyptian demand for the drug. And in the beginning of the 20th century, when the European powers and the United States took their first concrete steps to prevent or to regulate the cannabis trade the Greek government, in the first time, took concrete steps to eradicate cannabis fields in various islands, the Greek islands, and to suppress the trade from Greece to Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And so this did not really solve the problem of consumption in Egypt, because once this happened, the Egyptian turned for the first time to Lebanon and Syria to compensate for the loss of hashish supplies from Greece.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was a tremendous event, because what it had done is enmeshed for the first time Palestine in the drug trade. Palestine being situated as it does geographically between Lebanon, the producing state, and in the north, and Egypt, the consuming state, in the south, Israel in between. And so all hashish supplies that traveled from Lebanon, Syria to Egypt, whether by sea, by air, or by land, or by train, had to cross Palestine. And so it was that in the interwar period, Palestine became the main way station, or the main depot of hashish in the Middle East. Now, with availability, because they're so numerous and so many extensive, there was an extensive hashish trade between Lebanon and Egypt. And so with availability, there occurred a dramatic rise in cannabis consumption in Palestine itself, mostly by the Palestinian Arab population, right? In cafes, in hashish dens, in brothels, in the streets. I mean, I have reports show that by the mandatory police force, by the Palestine police force, that many people were wandering the streets stoned, right? And so there was an increase, a dramatic rise in hashish consumption in Palestine. And this was in a way in contradistinction to the pre-mandatory period, or the late Ottoman period, where hashish consumption was not seen and was not probably so dramatic. So this is, I think, where the modern history of hashish begins in Palestine, Israel. Because the hashish trade did not cease to exist after the establishment of the 1948, after the 1948 war and the establishment of the State of Israel. Drugs have their way to bypass or to evade borders. I mean, that has been established at least since the beginning of the war on drugs. Borders, I mean, smugglers or drugs don't really care about borders, right? They have a unique way, smugglers have a unique way to overcome such hurdles, as I show in my book, by the way, as well, right? So after 1948, the hashish trade continues, persists, right? In spite of better patrolling and better policing of the borders and better policing inside Israel's territory. And so again, what happens since the interwar period, it's actually two things, right? The first is that the shift of the trade routes from Greece to the Levant, right? And on the other hand, you have the war on drugs. You have the criminalization of drugs, which also date back to the interwar period, right? So this is when, you know, when drugs become criminalized, this becomes more interesting, because there's a black market, and there are consumers who there are drug dealers who operate in the shadows, who operate under the radar of the disciplinary state, and so you have the modern history of drugs, which is very exciting.
It is indeed very exciting. That's why I also enjoyed your book so much. And as you mentioned that in different areas, not Palestine, Israel, the consumption of hashish was part of the local cultural traditions, and with the establishment of the state of Israel, and also previously with the change of the smuggling routes, Palestine-Israel region became a major route for the smuggling. And also another aspect, like with the arrival of new inhabitants to the state of Israel, specifically Mizrahi Jews, consumption spread among Jews as well. And in your book, you wrote that it was only somehow located to the Mizrahi population at first, and there was this major intra-ethnic difference. Mizrahi Jews brought the custom either from the countries of their origin, or they started to smoke hashish in Israel. And Ashkenazi Jews, on the other hand, perceived hashish as a certain cultural threat, or as and certain type of hashishophobia emerged. So can you tell us why this was so, and what Oriental anxieties and fantasies that fear was based on? Because that's what you describe in your book, and also you mention certain colonial knowledge about the drug itself, and you already mentioned India previously. So if you can give us.
Sure. Well, first of all, again, this is not, cannabis has been identified globally, and even much before modernity. It has been associated with minorities, with disenfranchised groups, with the poor and fringe groups of society. And so cannabis, or hashish, began its history as a very negative intoxicant to begin with. And again, when you go to the modern period, the United States in the 19th century, or late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, cannabis is associated with Mexican migrants, right? And Blacks, who seem to so-called threaten the cultural tradition of mainstream white middle classes in the United States. At the same time, in Palestine, right, hashish was associated with the Arabs, and thus it was a differentiating mark between Arabs and Jews. But we also have to understand that the portrayal of cannabis as an Oriental vice, as a substance that somehow symbolizes that symbolizes the barbaric, so-called barbaric nature of Orientals, of their irrationality, right? Of their violent outbursts, of their dissociation with modern processes and trends, right? This all carries the baggage of colonial knowledge. Colonial knowledge that produced cannabis as an Oriental vice, as a token of their of Oriental barbarism, as a token of their insanity and irrationality. This is a knowledge that was produced in places such as India, the British in India. It was produced by the British in Egypt. And this knowledge arrives in Palestine from these localities, right? But after 1948, with the depopulation of Palestine by the Arab depopulation due to the Palestinian Nakba, and Israel's repopulation by Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, the Middle East Jews from North Africa and Middle East, they become now emblematic of hashish culture. Some of these Jews, not too many, a minority of these Jews, brought the habit with them from their home countries, but most of them had begun to use hashish here in Israel because of having been pushed to the margins of society, socially, economically, politically, right? According to my sources, the habit of hashish smoking by the Mizrahim was not widespread. Most 2,000 of them had begun or had smoked hashish, but this gave rise to a moral panic by the dominant forces in society, lest hashish would spread like, a contagion, would spread to the more enlightened, not to say white, Ashkenazi sector of society, and would lead then to the Levantanization or Orientalization of the Zionist project, and then, in other words, would threaten the Zionist project altogether. And again, this is, I think, one of the most depressing findings in my book. The extent to which drug discourses, whether medical or scientific or literary, are still based, by the way, not only in Israel, but still worldwide, based on colonial conceptualizations of drugs. And also the extent to which these understandings are still determined by class, racial and gendered anxieties and perspectives. And these persist, although, we live in the decolonial or post-colonial era, but we still make sense of drugs as we make sense of many other things, like gender, sexuality, and so on and so forth. We make sense of these still by colonial knowledge, by colonial discourses, and we treat them as regimes of truth. Right? I see this, by the way, every time when I teach a course on drugs, or even on gender and sexuality, is the extent to which our students consider these things as facts of life, as fixed, right? As something that has been bequeathed to us by nature or by God, right? So I think that my study has actually shown perhaps how we are still very much entangled with the colonial world, with the imperial world, right? So yes, cannabis is an Oriental vice. By the way, the term addiction is still imbued with is imbued with Orientalist knowledge, right? We would not have, again, addiction and drugs in the way that we understand them today are modern constructs. They did not exist before the late 19th century or early 20th century.
And we take it as a fact, as you mentioned, as something eternal, right? Eternal concept. That's how we treat also the concepts of, for example, heterosexuality as something which was not invented, but it's like settled or set since the beginning of our lives. Yeah, and it's super interesting how you are able in the book to show the whole circle, because as you mentioned, first of all, new arriving Mizrahi Jews to newly established Israel were marginalized since the very beginning, and that's how the vicious circle with class.
Cannabis or hashish, I'm sorry to interrupt, but yes, hashish was one means, one of many others.
Yeah.
By means of which the Mizrahim were pushed to the margins of society, and it was just one means among many that were used to not only to disenfranchise but to criminalize the Mizrahim. This was not just it was not just one device, but it was one among many others. Right? The leaders of the first Mizrahi revolt in Israel in 1959 were dismissed by the Israeli authorities as being drug addicts, meaning that they had supposedly they did not have any justifiable grievances against the state, but their protest actually emerged because they were delirious, right? Because of drug use, right? So it was a means to criminalize, to dismiss their grievances. And by the way, just like the 1936, again, one of the findings in my book is that the 1936 Arab Revolt in Palestine, which was, I think, the greatest anti-colonial insurgency in the Middle East at the time, was dismissed by both the British and the Jews, right, as being carried out because their leaders are stoned to death, because they had used hashish, which had sapped their rationality. They used hashish, which is why they're so violent. They're running amok, as it were, right? So you see a continuum before, 1948, the discrimination against and the criminalization of the Palestinians and their cause. There's a continuum to the post-1948 era where cannabis is again used in order to discriminate, in order to criminalize, in order to further push a disfranchised group to the margins of society.
Yeah. And so basically, you said that hashish or cannabis use was used, first of all, as a demarcation line between Jews and Arabs, and also afterwards for the delegitimization of the Mizrahim and their calls for social justice. So you already touched those Zionist narratives regarding Mizrahims with the regard of their hashish consumption. And I think it's important to look also at the question of the reflection of these narratives in the culture. And I spoke about your book with one of my friends, and he immediately mentioned one movie, and I think that the movie, sorry, I don't remember the name correctly, but I think it was made in 80s, and one female protagonist is there raped by a Mizrahi stoner. And
who was the victim though, exactly? Where does she come from?
Well, she was like Ashkenazi female, was raped there by a Mizrahi
So
stoner.
this is a colonial trope, of course.
Yeah,
okay.
And this was also somehow described in the books by Rachel Harris. This kind of plots in her books, Warriors, Witches, and Horse, is women in Israeli cinema, and that sexual violence was used as a way to critique certain groups of people and somehow facilitate then the Ashkenazi male heroism according to Zionist ethos of strength, health, and courage. And I think it's kind of, or I see certain contradictions in those narratives, because at the same time, hashish user is described as someone lacking willpower, as emasculated man, sometimes as a gay, and at the same time as a raging, super violent perpetrator of sexual violence against women. So what do you think about those contradictions?
Well, okay. Colonial and nation building narratives, and when I say nation building narratives, they also carry colonial narratives. I mean, we know that already, that there's no break between colonial and nation building narratives, because nationalism draws on colonial narratives. But so in any case, colonial and nation building narratives are ripe with contradictions. And these contradictions reflect the inconsistencies, the instability of these discourses, and the anxieties, in many ways, of the discourses producers. Right? Again, just like Orientalist portrayals of other indigenous people, right? They could be, on the one hand, these indigenous people, right? They could be sexually insubordinate and excessively sexual, right? But on the other hand, they could be indolent and lax, and they could be, again, on the one hand, they could be irrational and violent, but on the other hand, they could be immobile and manipulable by more powerful people. So these are contradictions that we see all around, the colonial and the national world. The same thing about cannabis. When I was looking at the colonial, at the scientific, as it were, knowledge that was produced in the interwar period. So according to this colonial expert knowledge, cannabis could lead to overt sexuality. It could lead to violent reaction, but on the other hand, it would lead to laziness, right? Laxity and manipulability. And these contradictions are not solved. They are constantly, they come together. With the experts not really being able to put the finger that these are contradictions and they need to be resolved. But this is a characteristic of Orientalist discourses and colonial discourses, as well as nation-building discourses. I mean, we have to kind of accept them as a proof of the instability and the tensions that exist, despite the ambition, right, to consistency and so on and so forth by the producers.
So basically, these contradictions and inconsistencies, we can say it's an essential part of this anxieties and this nation building framing, I think.
Right, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And as you mentioned, one framing, the laziness and lack of willpower. Do you think that the moral panic surrounding cannabis in Israel was also somehow caused by the fear that people will become somehow unmotivated to fight and serve the country, as we saw it, for example, in USA during and after Vietnam War, when marijuana and LSD were connected to hippies and anti-war movements and so on?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, of course. I mean, this is all part of the concern or the panic that Israel would become, or Israel would become over-orientalized.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the fear was that Israeli soldiers would become immobilized by taking drugs,
Mm-hmm.
with the example of Egypt always being suggested.
Mm-hmm.
That we don't want Israel to become a second Egypt. We don't want Israel to be immobilized by drugs, just like the Egyptian army had been immobilized by drugs, as supposedly evidenced by the 1967 war. Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How would our youngsters fly the jets? How would they be able to fearlessly, diligently fight against our enemies? Right.
Mm-hmm.
This was one of the major causes of the hashishophobia,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that was widespread in Israeli society during the 1950s and the 1960s. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And it's also fascinating to see how, even though these fears were present, the army eventually became a part of the smuggling process, especially during the 80s, after the in aftermath of invading Lebanon and so on.
No, the Israeli army, again, reported
not the like, I don't mean, of course, not of like, but I mean the soldiers, like
oh, you mean after the
soldiers,
1982?
not the army itself, of course.
1982 war, yes, with Israeli occupation of Lebanon, yes, many officers
Mm-hmm.
and many ordinary soldiers took a part in smuggling hashish into Israel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Which was one of the reasons for the expansion of hashish consumption in Israeli society. Absolutely.
Yeah, and
I was in my 20s during that time.
Uh-huh.
I vividly remember that era.
Yeah.
As a golden age
age.
of weed culture in Israel. Absolutely.
Yeah. I also have some friends who mention the hashish from Lebanon as the best one. So
I wouldn't know.
Of course. But if we go a bit back, in your book, you named the 1967 war as, now I will quote, a watershed event in the history of hashish and marijuana consumption in Israeli society. The war unleashed a historical trajectory in which hashish marijuana culture in the Jewish state transformed, expanded, and underwent a steady process of normalization. And today, Israel is, according to the surveys, at the top of the cannabis use by adult population. So could you provide us with details on the reason for such a boom in just few decades after all the years of fears, anxieties, colonial knowledge, and what caused that this feared and illicit substance associated with the underworld and Levantinization of Jewish state became such a popular and widespread recreational drug? And I know that it's not a easy question to answer it briefly, but
I will do my best. Okay, first of all, I think that, since the late 1960s to the present, there is a global trend whereby there is a normalization, at least, of recreational cannabis.
Mhm.
And this normalization, I think, is gaining steam in recent years because as more and more people consume the drugs, they understand that what they have been told about it is nonsense, right? So old mythologies about the substance evaporate, right? They understand all of a sudden that what they have been told, right, and there is a dissonance between what they have been told and their own experiences, right? So this is one thing that is tied to global trends and circumstances, and there is another which is tied to global circumstances in which that Israel, since the late 1960s, becomes more and more entangled with the globalized world. But there is also more immediate or local reasons for that. First of all, following the 1967 war, there has been a trend of volunteers coming to Israel from all around the world, whether Europe, South Africa, Canada, the United States, volunteers from these states, and they come to Israel, and they initiate Israelis into drug culture, whether it is cannabis or LSD, right? But there, again, more concrete reasons is that because of the 1967 war and the occupation of the West Bank and Sinai and Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, there are vast quantities of hashish trapped within Israel. They could no longer make their way to Egypt. And so these supplies, instead of being dispatched to Egypt, they are being dispatched to the local market. And then again, you have the syndrome of greater accessibility, greater availability, and so on and so forth. Another reason would be that because of the occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, Israelis gain access to previously to markets, to drug markets that previously were beyond their reach. East Jerusalem becomes the Mecca of Israelis who would like to have a smoke. The Arab cafes in East Jerusalem are populated or visited or frequented not by Arabs, but by Jews of Ashkenazi descent. That come there either to smoke or to buy stash, right, to bring it back home. Yeah. Right. So all of these forces, all of these processes come together, and they might. And oh yes, and there is also since the 2000. Okay, this is a very important point. Because of the wall that was built in Egypt, right? And because of the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, Israelis come to the awareness that it would be easier for them to grow their own weed instead of being dependent on exports or smuggling. And so all of these, again, I'm sorry that this is some sort of a chaotic presentation of what I'm trying to say, but as you said, this is very, very complex, and I need to simplify it. So all of these forces, trends, and circumstances come together to give a push to the normalization of cannabis in Israel. Not only the normalization, but I think what was implied here is that this is no longer a habit that is limited to the marginalized sectors of society. This is now a habit that is shared by all Israelis,
Mm-hmm.
settlers, politicians, doctors, physicians, lawyers, settlers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even Orthodox Jews, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this is no longer a habit that is distinctive of a certain sector of society, but everybody smokes. Everybody smokes.
Yeah, and so you think, or with cannabis in Israel, like right now, there is, or I put it differently, cannabis use is no longer any demarcation line through the society anymore.
Right.
Or is there any demarcation line between the using it for medical purposes or using it as a healthy person? Or is this just, again, the question of the
I'm sorry,
discourse?
you froze. Your picture froze, and could you repeat the question?
Right now, it's working right now.
The picture froze and the sound as well, but now it's better again.
Okay. So my question was whether there is at least a demarcation line between medical use and use for other purposes, or is this just also a question of discourse we are in?
Well, the division between medical and recreational is modern.
Mm-hmm.
In pre-modern times, people consume drugs, and the recreational and the medicinal
Just overlap somehow.
Overlapped.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that what we are witnessing now is a return,
Mm-hmm.
in many ways, or the division becomes less and less valid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, how would you distinguish between medical and, even if you smoke to feel, better, to feel more relaxed, is this recreational or is this medicinal?
Yeah.
So I think that in many ways, even science now is beginning to fall under the impression, or to gain the impression, that this division is very blurry, is very ambiguous, and that perhaps we should do away with it in many ways, especially when we deal with cannabis, which brings comfort to many people who are ill, certain diseases. It perhaps it doesn't make them well, but it treats the symptoms in a way that it makes suffering more sufferable.
Yeah.
Right.
Sure. Yeah, and it's also connected to the current research on psychedelics, right? Or the psychedelic renaissance.
Absolutely.
For like using psilocybin for treating PTSD and so on. So
precisely, absolutely.
Okay, I think, or I'm afraid that we already used all our allocated time, unfortunately, because I would have much more questions. So thank you
So much for having me. Thank you, Timea.
Thank you, and we are looking forward to read some new works of you.
Thank you so much, and good luck.